Thank you very much for sticking it out to the bitter end here. I'm very honored to be up here and talking to you about the people part of the program. It occurred to me last week when I was working on this that even though I've helped organize 11 conferences, this is the first time I've spoken at one. So I've spoken at a lot of conferences in a lot of places. I probably feel more nervous and intimidated, especially after the last 2 days at this one, than anything else that I've done. So I want to welcome everybody here. This talk is a little bit different. I don't know about you, but I feel sort of saturated by this point by a lot of great ideas and thinking, and I'm going to kind of take us in a little bit of a different direction, sort of take my new job description as professional daydreamer as literally as I can, and do a little bit of daydreaming here for you today. Before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the students in the room. There are a lot of students here. I was talking to one. Let's give students stand up. Everybody see the students stand up. Really appreciate you being here, and I know you're from a lot of different schools around New Mexico, and really also appreciate you sticking it out to the end here. So I was tasked with the people part of this. I kind of gave this a lot of thought about how to kind of go about this. I didn't want to sort of cover some ground that other folks have covered, so I decided to create a talk a little bit different, and we're going to talk about a little bit about human nature and what kind of makes us work. It makes us sort of think about the decisions that we do. Hopefully by the end of it, it'll make more sense. So this talk represents a personal journey for me that began when I was 15 years old, taking a world history class in high school. The class absolutely blew me away. It was full of Egyptian pharaohs, hanging gardens of Babylon, Greek temples, Minoan battle axes, and Roman legions. Wow. This class was absolutely fascinating, but it also raised a question in my mind that has never gone away, which was, why do people do the things that they do? Why do they build empires and create great art? Why do they wage war? Why do civilizations rise and fall and fade away? Why do we make bad decisions? What's up with us anyway? So, seeking answers to these questions pushed me into an early career in archaeology, and have infused my work and my interest ever since. The question of why we do what we do came roaring back to me this last September while visiting the famous Stone Age cave paintings in the Dordogne region of France with my family. My family's here, over here, sitting with our children and my wife. And looking at these cave paintings, I was absolutely blown away, first and foremost, by how beautiful they are. And they reach across a vast gulf of time to speak to us as if they were painted yesterday, suggesting that something deep in our nature is at work in these caves. The paintings are also enigmatic. Why are they there? What is their purpose? What was going on in the minds of our Cro-Magnon ancestors when they walked deep into the absolute blackness of these caves to make these remarkable images? No one really knows. It didn't make a lot of sense, and yet somehow it did. What's up with us anyway? It's not an idle question anymore, not as we contemplate the kind of global jam we find ourselves in terms of population, pressure, food, water, climate, and the rest of the challenges that we've discussed over the last 2 days. Very simply, we got ourselves into this mess, and we're the only ones who are going to get ourselves out of this mess. And to do that, I realized that we're going to have to understand ourselves better, what we do, why we make the decisions that we make, and why we screw up. That means understanding our nature as people, if that's possible, and that's what I'm going to try and talk about today. Before I make a stab at this, though, I want to back up and discuss what may very well be our greatest challenge as a species, a challenge that I think gives a great deal of urgency to our situation. Very quietly, in December 2009, the publication of the first newsletter of a new working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy, or ICS, shook up the normally staid academic community of geological stratigraphers with an idea whose implications could possibly affect every living creature on the planet. It was the first newsletter of the Anthropocene Working Group, whose mission is to analyze the idea that we are now living in a new geological interval of time, the Anthropocene, quote, that is dominated by human activities, a term that has been widely used by a range of earth and environmental scientists, suggesting a case for formally incorporating the term into the geological timescale. And this is the entire history of the earth here. This is the official chart controlled by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. In other words, the current epoch, the Holocene, 11,000 years old, may officially be coming to an end. They go on, the newsletter goes on, the rationale behind the suggestion, the newsletter continued, was the recognition of the wide-ranging effects of anthropogenic influence on stratigraphically significant parameters, global atmospheric composition, temperature, ocean chemistry, sea level, biodiversity, landscape processes, and near-surface sedimentation, which I guess only a stratigrapher could actually love. The resulting people-driven changes will almost certainly be reflected in a distinctive geological record. The working group was tasked to make recommendations to the International Commission on Stratigraphy, which then would make a recommendation to its parent body, which is the International Union of Geological Sciences. And that's exactly what's happening. After a series of meetings and favorable votes, a formal proposal to formalize the Anthropocene, or the era of people, is being developed right now by the working group for submission to the ICS in 2016. And that's actually really, really fast for stratigraphers. Apparently, the current mood among the scientists is that the proposal will pass. And this is important because the ICS decides that the Holocene is over, it's over. And I'm gonna try a little laser printer here. You can see the Holocene's right, that tiny little thing. This is for, a billion years here, and there's the Holocene right up there at the top. Why should we care? Well, there are two very good reasons why we should pay close attention to this academic debate. The first is the nature of the Holocene itself, which is characterized by stability, especially temperature and sea stability. This is a slide of 1 million years of Earth temperature. In fact, the duration of the stability is anomalous in recent Earth history. Typically, the planet goes through dramatic swings in temperature, plunging into various ice ages, for example, on a fairly regular basis. The Holocene, which is right there, is different, or was different. A good word to describe the Holocene, in fact, is clement. And clement means mildness, moderation, lenient, and merciful. In contrast, the previous epoch, called the Pleistocene, which lasted for almost 2 million years, can certainly be called inclement, as you can see from the graph. If you were a hunter-gatherer alive in the Pleistocene making cave paintings, you probably did not consider the climate to be mild, moderate, lenient, or merciful, or not for very long. In the Anthropocene, which is represented right there at the top, inclemency will return. Indeed, for some around the world, including millions of Americans on the eastern seaboard right now, inclemency is becoming the new normal. The second reason to care what happens to the Holocene, and there's the actual temperature chart for the Holocene itself, is because it coincides precisely with the rise and expansion of a project called human civilization. 11,000 years ago, humans began giving up their very ancient tradition of hunting and gathering for a life in settled communities, igniting a revolution of unprecedented achievement. The invention of agriculture and the domestication of livestock, both of which followed the invention of the village, allowed populations to grow and specialize. Villages became cities, cities became empires, empires incubated arts and sciences, monarchies and armies flourished, as did great religious movements. New lands were explored and conquered, societies became increasingly complex and regimented, technologies and innovations pushed monumental architecture to new height, populations grew and diversified, the art world expanded and profoundly influencing us, discovery of new lands, and feats of engineering and quests, and monarchies grew, economic prosperity followed, liberty, scientific enlightenment, economic prosperity, but not without rising costs, both in physical and mental, which in turn fired our imaginations, fueling new radical theories about how the world actually works, stoking moral outrage and a push for justice, a quest for freedom in a world that was rapidly changing from the old order to a new order, dominated by revolutionary new modes of transportation, destructive wars, a modern sensibility in the arts and entertainment with shocks, both negative and positive, throughout the 20th century, all culminating in a remarkable burst of creativity, energy, social progress, scientific leaps, equality, technological advances, arriving at, yes, You guessed it, the apotheosis of Western civilization, Homer Simpson. I haven't quite figured out if Homer is the poster child of the Holocene or the Anthropocene. Either way, he looks sort of shocked as to what's happening. So leaving the Holocene behind is no small deal for humanity. It nurtured us with its stability and its clemency as we grew into the complex, crowded, diverse people that we are today. Like a child that has grown up in a loving home, it's going to be hard to leave this nest. By the way, the idea for the Anthropocene, I feel like I need to explain this, is credited to Paul Crutzen, a Nobel-winning Dutch chemist who popularized the term back in 2000 while attending a scientific conference. Crutzen grew agitated at a speaker's repeated use of the word Holocene to describe the current era. Let's stop it, he blurted out. We are no longer in the Holocene, we are in the Anthropocene. Well, he said, it was quiet in the room after that. And then the group took a coffee break, he said, and the Anthropocene was the main topic of discussion. Well, they're still talking about it, which has exasperated Crutzen. Last year, he stressed the urgency of the situation in a piece published in Yale's online forum, Environment 360, in which he wrote, the Anthropocene, the human dominance of biological, chemical, and geological processes on Earth is already an undeniable reality. Evidence is mounting that the name change suggested by one of us more than 10 years ago is overdue. Rather than representing yet another sign of human hubris, however, he wrote, this name change would stress the enormity of the challenges that we face and humanity's responsibility as stewards of the earth. It would highlight the immense power of our intellect and our creativity and the opportunities they offer us in shaping our future. He wrote that we need innovations tailored to the needs of the poorest. Examples include new plant varieties that can withstand climate change, robust laptops packed with practical agricultural advice, market information for small-scale farmers, things that we've heard in the last couple of days. Global agriculture must become high-tech and organic at the same time, allowing farms to benefit from the health of natural habitats. He ended this way. Imagine our descendants in the year 2200 or 2500. They might liken us to aliens who have treated the earth as if it were a mere stopover for refueling, or even worse, characterized as barbarians who would ransack their own home. Living up to the Anthropocene means building a culture that grows with the Earth's biological wealth instead of depleting it. In this new era, he concluded, nature is us. So, I bring this all up because despite the imminent arrival of the Anthropocene, we are still thinking squarely within the box called the Holocene. This is a danger because much of what we consider business as usual today simply won't cut it in this new era. And you heard a lot about this in the last 2 days. The time has come to think outside the Holocene, and we can do this by asking a few basic questions, such as what is likely to stay behind and what is likely to continue? What can we take with us into the Holocene, and what do we need to leave behind? A couple quotes along these lines that I found I wanted to share with you. I like this one a lot by E.O. Wilson, who's an eminent Harvard biologist and really kind of a Renaissance person on a lot of levels. He wrote, we have created a Star Wars civilization with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. We are terribly confused by the mere fact of our existence and a danger to ourselves and to humanity, which is kind of a way to think about it. And this is why we need to focus on kind of who we are and why we do what we do. So into whatever is coming next, some of the answers to what we leave behind and what we take with us are pretty straightforward. And I won't go into too much detail with them. We know that there are basic ecological processes that will go with us no matter what happens, and these are important for us to work in a positive manner. We also know that as humans, we're going to need what I call the 5 F's: food, fuel, fiber, forage, and fresh water. And we've talked a lot about this. A friend of mine who's in the room here today likes to put a 6th F on the list, what we'll need in the next era, which is firearms, but we don't want to talk about firearms, so talk about that. So, and then what we've heard the last couple days, we can make a long list of things that we need to take with us. We know this now. We know that these things work. Maybe they don't work quite at the scale we want them to yet. And this is kind of a way of summing up a lot of things that happened and we talked about the last 2 days. we can't leave these things behind. We have to take them with us. We can't think out of the whole scene without trying to understand them and try to understand us as well. So we know all this. We know kind of the practices. We know what we need to do. We're still trying to figure out some of the economics and stuff. But I want to go in a different place now. Now that we've kind of set up this thing, I want to go to. Well, let's see. I'm sorry, I forgot about this. So this is not the question of who we are, what we do, why we do it. It's not just kind of a question of agriculture. This is a quote from David Tillman, who is a prominent ecologist at the University of Minnesota. This was a paper sent to me a couple of weeks ago, talking about the same issues that we're all concerned about. And it's a very interesting quote. He says, all the environmental issues on Earth are the problems created by humanity, and we're the ones that are going to be able to solve them. This effort will require that we learn not just more about the environment as scientists, we've got to learn more about ourselves, which is exactly what Socrates said, right, 2,000 years ago. If you remember your humanities class back in college, his instruction to us 2,000 years ago was to know thyself. This is really sort of the oldest instruction that we've had from our teachers. We've done sometimes a kind of a poor job of trying to understand who we are, but it's a question that still bedevils us, as I found when I found this slide, know thyself, from the Matrix. So this brings me to Paul Gauguin, and Paul Gauguin's questions. For those of you who don't know who Paul Gauguin was, he was a post-impressionist painter. This was his final masterpiece, painted in 1897. He was kind of a conflicted person, not kind of a conflicted person, he was. He started his career as a banker in France, got disenchanted with not just banking, but the whole kind of culture of Europe at the time. He threw it over for painting, hung out with Van Gogh, painting in the southern part of France one summer, and eventually ended up in the Polynesia, where he really pushed a lot of boundaries. And he pushed a lot, not just artistic boundaries. He asked some pretty profound and serious questions about who we are as people. And this is one of the important roles of art in society, to ask these kind of questions. Up in the corner there, right there, is the title of this painting. He died not long after he finished this too. And here's what it says. It's in French, of course. He asked, where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? And this is, I think, really an important way to kind of look at these larger issues about the future and our nature. So I'm going to go through this myself and try to answer some of these questions, because we can now, and it's been really an educational process for me in the last couple of months as I try to pull this talk together, try to answer some of Paul Gauguin's questions, because I don't think we can really solve the problems in front of us until we understand who we are in greater detail. I'm not a researcher, I'm not an academic, so these are the books that I read. I'm going to pull this information out for you. If you have an interest in these topics, I recommend the book in the middle by Nicholas Wade, who's a science writer for the New York Times. So if there are any errors here in what I'm going to tell you, I will blame it on myself. So back to Gauguin. So we're going to go through this, and I hope you kind of swing with me on this, because we end up in a good place here at the end. I'm going to answer his first question. Where do we come from? And this is, there's been a great deal of science in the last 10 years on a lot of these questions, particularly in genetics, trying to understand our DNA paths. And I was really blown away when I started to looking into this question about where we come from and what we are. The quick answer to that question, of course, is we are from Africa. We know this. We started millions of years ago. We have a joint ancestor. We share an ancestor with chimpanzees. There at the juncture right here about 6 million years ago. At some stage, our ancestor decided to take his chances in open woodlands, climbed out of the trees, developed bipedalism, which is really on the way to becoming a human. Next step here was the development of our ancestors, including the early Australopithecines, who look like this, about 4 million years ago. So the development of humans from chimps went through really kind of a wild process a lot of bottlenecks and dead ends, and somehow we emerged on the other side here. Australopithecines grew in size over time, and you can see that we branched up here into the Homo line here, where we end up looking like this, and I think this is a very thoughtful Homo habilis. And what's interesting about this, our development, is that most of the big leaps evolutionary for us happened in periods of environmental stress. They think that the early ancestors came down out of the trees during a period of prolonged drought when the forests shrank, creating a lot of competition among primates and our ancestors. They hit the ground running, so to speak, and then the evolution into the Homo habilis line was also another period of profound drought when the African forest shrank and the diet changed. And I hope I don't offend vegetarians in the room, but they have clearly correlated a change in our nature, particularly our brain size, to the development of a meat diet. The Australopithecines were vegetarians, and the Homo line began to eat meat, and this had not just a kind of protein consequence for our ancestors, but it began us down a road of kind of a sociability because we began to hunt as groups, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Eating meat allowed for a smaller gut and a bigger brain. The first stone tools appeared about this time in response to the need to prepare meat for consumption, and the hunt almost certainly also promoted sociality and cooperation. And you can see some of that in the development of the kind of the brain size here. Up at the top here, after we go through a couple more million years of evolution, we get to the kind of three final branches of the Homo line here. One of which is Homo erectus, who lived largely in the Asian areas. Peking man, if folks are familiar with their history, this is what Homo erectus, and in case you want to know who your daddy was. Also the other two lines, the famous Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, lived in this part of the world. And they trace back about 600,000 years, and then about 250,000 years, Homo sapiens show up in Africa. And so those are the three sort of final parts of this evolutionary process. I like this. I had to throw this in. I'm sorry. So this, you talk about the evolutionary stages that we go through. I thought this was pretty cute. Here we are. Doesn't that feel right? It feels right. So we know a lot of this. This is not new, I think, for folks if you're familiar with some of your paleontology. But what was new was this, and this really surprised me when I read about it. And 73,000 years ago, Mount Toba, which is in Sumatra, exploded. It was one of the largest eruptions in recent Earth history. 67 cubic miles of mountain vanished into space, ushering in an intense period of global cooling. Hard hit especially was Africa, and they know this. It's really amazing how they can figure this out. They can look at some of the sediments and things. By comparison, the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, also in Sumatra, caused the year without summer in 1816 when people starved all over the world. In fact, if you're a fan of Frankenstein, the story, those guys hold up and told each other stories in the summer of 1816. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein as a result of that eruption. Mount Tambora was nothing compared to what Mount Toba did. It created a global crisis, and it put Homo sapiens through a near extinction event, what the geneticists call a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck, where the populations declined rapidly, and there was a genetic simplification that happened, where we end up with what the researchers call the ancestral human population. This is important because if we're going to try to understand who we are and why we behave and do what we do, we really need to understand this population. It was only 5,000 individuals. And they know this from DNA, and the DNA analysis is really incredibly sophisticated. I want to come back to that a little bit later. Every person on the planet right now is related to these 5,000 people. Probably the population of, I don't know, Cuba, New Mexico, something like that. And it was probably bunched up in one part of Africa as they just tried to sweat out this intense environmental crisis that had befallen them. And what's so interesting is what happens next. So if you look at that 73,000 years ago dividing line, on the left there are what was called an anatomically modern humans. These are the old Homo sapiens that had been around for about 250,000 years. And as I said before, they had been making stone tools for about 1 million years. That technology hadn't changed in 1 million years. And physically, we're the same then as we are today, meaning the way our skulls and things look like. We're anatomically modern. We've been that way for a long time. But after 73,000 years ago, after this cataclysmic event that put humans through this genetic bottleneck, we totally change. We become a completely different kind of species. Art appears. Language is traced back to this period of time. Music. Eventually, the fine art of the cave paintings. They begin to wear clothes. They do fishing. The technology changes dramatically, all within a few thousand years of this massive eruption. You get the needle. This is one of the most underrated and important inventions in human history, the needle. They can start making their own clothes. And they can figure out exactly when we started to wear clothes. They studied the DNA of body lice, of all things. Body lice, when the body lice appeared. So we began to wear clothes about 70,000 years ago. Physical adornment. We became, in other words, and I didn't know this until I read this, we were Homo sapiens until this event, and then we became Homo sapiens sapiens. This is where that second sapiens comes in. We're smart people. I might argue with that today, but this is how it kind of evolved in terms of evolutionary terms. So in a sense, there was, in fact, an Eden of sorts. They think the highlands of central Ethiopia is where a lot of this took place. If you know a little bit about the DNA, our DNA, there was, in fact, an Adam and an Eve. Every male on the planet is related to a single male in that ancestral population. I won't go into all the details. They can follow the Y chromosome all the way down. They can tell from mitochondrial DNA. They can look back there's an Eve a little bit farther back in time. And through genetic drift, we ended up with kind of the populations today. So about 65,000 years ago, after all these changes to our nature, that ancestral population now becomes cognitive, it becomes alive. We have symbolic thinking now. And this is just amazing. I don't know how they can figure this out. Every person who's a non-African today is related to a band of 150 individuals that left Ethiopia and traveled across what's called the Gate of Grief. The water level is much lower at that time. And the rest of the world is populated from that 150 person band. And they just know this genetically. And we went off to the races at this point. Humans expanded all across the planet, pushing Homo erectus and Homo neanderthalensis off the map. A little bit sorry for them. And then we continue to spread kind of around the planet in a fairly short amount of time. Give you kind of a sense of what our nature is up to. We just were smarter, we had more technology, we were problem solvers, all those things that we kind of talk about today just kind of burst out of Africa about 65,000 years ago. And they know this from the DNA mapping. And again, it's just sort of extraordinary how they've been able to look back in the past here. And I wanted to quote from Nicholas Wade's book here to end this section. So Wade says that when the ancestral human population dispersed across the world about 50,000 years ago, evolution set in motion a grand experiment. Each population in its fiercely guarded territory would develop in its own way. This development would be both cultural, leading to a vast family of different languages, religions, and lifestyles, and also genetic, as the members of each society responded to different climates, ecologies, and social arrangements of their own making. Isolated on the separate continents, the far-flung branches of the human family were allowed to follow different trajectories, each adapted to the strange world that lay beyond the boundaries of their ancestral homeland. So, I think we've gone a long way to answering Gauguin's first question, where did we come from? It's an amazing story. And I like this cover of National Geographic. It's the most amazing story we have. it's the greatest story ever told. And not just where we came from and how we dispersed and who we are, but it's a fabulous story of scientific inquiry. How they've been able to really pierce into the misty past and explain who we are in many, many different ways. So we go back to Gauguin now, and we feel like we've answered Paul's first question. Let's ask and try to answer his second question, which is, what are we? And in this case, we also have a great deal of knowledge. The science community here has also just unearthed amazing amounts of stuff, and I think it's important to understand also what we are. And the quick answer there is that we, of course, are apes. We have a common ancestor with chimpanzees. They're our closest relatives. And thanks to really an amazing amount of work by primatologists for now almost 60 years, we understand a lot about our deep nature, what the common ancestor to chimps and humans was probably all about. We're also related to bonobos, which are a species in south of the Zaire River, which also tells us a lot about our nature, but I'm going to come back to them in just a little bit. We're going to talk about chimps first. And what's important about this, as they've discovered, is that when you look at chimp society, and they didn't think about this at first until they really studied it closely, chimp society is violent. Out of 4,000 mammals and 10 million other animal species on the planet, only two species on the whole planet deliberately commit warfare on each other, chimps and humans. We are a warfare tending species. It's deep in our nature because they can see it, and when they compare it to chimp society. Chimps will, I didn't know this, chimps will go out in little bands and they'll find other chimps and other bands and they'll beat them to death. And no other species on the planet does that. So that tells us, and I thought this was sort of an interesting slide, so that we are by nature an aggressive species. And there's just sort of no getting around it. And we put a lot of sideboards on this, but our deep nature is aggressive. We are also tribal. No surprise here. I like what E.O. Wilson has written about this. He said that an absolute universal of human nature is to form groups and defend that group enthusiastically against rival groups. People must have a tribe, he writes. It gives them a name in addition to their own social meaning in a chaotic world. And they've actually done a lot of research on this where they divide people into groups, and people swiftly and decisively divide themselves into groups and then discriminate in favor of the group to which they belong, even when they're told that they've been divided randomly into these groups. Participants always ranked the out-group below the in-group and judged their opponents to be less likable, less fair, less trustworthy, even when they're told about the random selection. And he writes, in its power and universality, the tendency to form groups and then favor the in-group members has all the earmarks of instinct. And this, I think, relates to a lot of what we're talking about. We tend to talk about ranchers, environmentalists, and we talk about this and that. We're still talking about groups, the in-group, the out-group, and overcoming this, trying to struggle against this, is part of what we're all trying to do here today. This question of tribalism is what scientists call an example of epigenetic behavior, which is the result of the interaction of natural and cultural evolution over a long, long period of time. Epigenetic rules govern the way our senses perceive the world and the symbolic coding which we represent the world and the options that we give ourselves. So we're looking to the future. How do we get out of these jams? We've got to understand these epigenetic rules, of which another one is territoriality. We like our little territories and we'll defend them rather strenuously against other ones. And then I thought, here's an example of when epigenetic rules go bad. We end up with things like Nazism. So more deep nature, and this is, I think, still important to understand who we are, try to answer Gauguin's question. More deep nature, families are the basic unit of society. We share this with chimp societies as well. Who have complex family structures and relationships And both chimp society and human society, about 150 people is about the max. If you read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, he talks a lot about the 150 rule. Kind of beyond 150, we start losing track of who's who. Group size generally tends to be, especially in hunter-gatherer societies, tends to be about 150 people. What we do not share with chimp society is the pair bond. And they actually can look way, way back in time. The male-female bonding is a human behavior that goes back millions of years. They actually can, I'm not sure how they can do it, they can look at physical stuff and say that humans, the nuclear family, the pair bond, the nuclear family, a very human behavior. Chimps don't do this, but humans do it, and it goes far back in time. Also, way back in our nature is this idea of sociality. Wilson likes to talk about, we invented fire about 1 million years ago. He said fire wasn't the big invention. The important invention was more important was the campfire. A campfire, sitting around after the hunt or planning the next hunt. This is where stories began to be told. This is where bonding happens. This is where we began to do the cooperation and collaboration activities that became part of our nature later in life. And if you have been in a Boy Scout or Girl Scout and have gone camping in the fire, remember how much that fire means to us? It's deep in our nature. And I'm sorry, sitting in front of a computer screen doesn't count as the same thing. I'm saying this is not the kind of bonding thing that our deep nature wants us to do. That's just my personal unscientific opinion. So. And the point here is that we run up against it. When we run up against our nature, I think we're heading off in the wrong direction. But we have to understand what that nature is. The other thing that we do really, really well, and in fact, some researchers say this is our specialty, is determine intentionality. Looking at the person across from you, understanding what is on their minds, particularly if they're going to strike you or not, but also looking collaboratively. Is that person friendly? Can I work with them? They see this in young children when they put them together, trying to understand what is on their mind. If you have, I like this when body language goes bad. So understanding body language, understanding our intentions is fundamental to who we are. This leads to reciprocity. This is sort of the give and take involved in all societies. I give you something, you give something, I give something back to you. It's very core to human existence. Chimps do this too, but not to the degree that we do it. This led to cooperation on the hunt, which led eventually to cooperation behavior today. It led very early to trade. And trade is something that no other species on the planet does. We did it early. And if you ever spent a night with 8-year-olds after a night of trick-or-treating on Halloween and watch them horse trade candy, you know that this is a deep human behavior. So it brings me back to bonobos, which is, and again, I didn't know this, and it was really interesting to read about this. Where chimp society is male-dominated and aggressive, bonobos are female-dominated and conciliatory. Perhaps this represents a characteristic of our shared ancestor. Chimps and humans share the desire to defend territory and seek the extermination of rivals. In contrast, bonobo society, females form alliances and face down aggressive males. One big result, for example, is the banishment of infanticide, which is a practice that happens frequently in chimp society. There are no murderous raids on neighboring bonobos. They even get along with chimps. One researcher went on to comment that bonobos also have a lot more sex, meaning it serves as a social purpose as well. Males can't tell when female bonobos are ovulating, so they have sex frequently without fighting with each other, and creates kind of a social cohesion that chimp society doesn't have. The point is that this conciliatory behavior is likely deeply rooted in our nature as well. Since humans, chimps, and bonobos all share a common ancestor, it might explain why humans come by the contradictory impulses of aggression and conciliation. One primatologist put it this way: being both more brutal than chimps, more empathetic than bonobos, we are by far the most bipolar ape. Our societies are never completely peaceful, never completely competitive, never ruled by sheer selfishness, and never perfectly moral. This leads, I think, to altruism. This is one of the things as a bedeviled evolutionary biologist for a long, long time. Why are humans altruistic? The root, of course, seems to be in this bonobo behavior of conciliation. But altruism is something that's very deep in our nature, and of course has been sort of expressed over time. Humans have a way of making things a lot more complicated, so here's how altruism looks today. But it has sort of a deep root in who we are, and I thought this was best exemplified in this Calvin and Hobbes saying that he answers the phone and says, should I take a message, what's in it for me? And then he says, well, they always assume you're some sort of altruist. So altruism is part of our nature, which brings us to the second line of scientific inquiry into our nature, which is to look at that ancestral human population. I should speed up here a little bit, which is a fancy way of kind of looking at our left brains and right brains, what happened after that genetic bottleneck. And of course, as we all know, we are imaginative. We're a species that has taken that symbolic behavior, the cognitive stuff, to do things and express it in amazing ways over the last 60, 70,000 years. And I like that quote by Einstein there, creativity is intelligence having fun. So this is kind of our right brain. The left brain is analytical. These are other parts. The other side of our brain, which tends to be the problem-solving side, we tend to solve any kind of problem that comes along to us, which I think is encouraging. Good stuff, and then maybe not so good stuff in some ways. So all of this leads to this, which is just my take on what the research says. We have basically 6 kind of deep nature, near nature traits. We have this part of us, which are the chimp side of things, and then we have the other side of us, of our nature, more conciliatory, more imaginative, analytical, and these two things fight with each other all the time. In fact, this is what the researchers say really makes us human. These two sides of our nature struggle constantly with each other, creating what has confounded us through many, many years. How do we explain our contradictory behavior? How do we do what we do? Why do we do the crazy things that we do? Why do we do things like this? Let's procrastinate now and panic later, right? So how do we do? And how do we, this was a fabric softener ad. I thought it was kind of an interesting way of looking at our kind of schizophrenic behavior. So we have a pretty good sense now of what's inside of us, our deep nature, our near nature, and how it influences our contradictory behavior. This is all hardwired into us, and I think it's important to try to, as we look down the road, look in the future, as we leave the Holocene behind, look in the Anthropocene, to try to understand what it is that we're taking with us. And the researchers have given us really a lot to work with. So this brings me back to Gauguin again. And this brings me now to his question, his third question, which is, where are we going? And this one is harder to answer. This one is not available to us really scientifically. The scientists can tell us some things about the future. They know we're leaving, as I said before in the introduction, we're leaving the Holocene, we're moving into this other place. We can guess at some of the things that are going to happen, but fundamentally we don't really know where we're going. So to try to answer this question, I decided to turn to someone I knew from my research, which is Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold thought about the same questions. He asked the same kinds of things that Paul Gauguin was doing, and he actually put them all together in his life's masterwork, also produced at the end of his life, of course, the Sand County Almanac. He was trying to understand why we do the things we do. Why do we do self-destructive things on the land? And all his career, I believe he was looking for the answers to the same question that Gauguin was asking. I'm going to run quickly through a little bit of his biography for those of you who may not be familiar with him, because when I get to the end here, it'll make a little more sense. So Leopold graduated from the Yale Forestry School. One of the first graduates, went to the Southwest as a ranger with the Forest Service. And became a forester. He became a supervisor of the Carson National Forest 100 years ago this year, married into a prominent New Mexico family. After he took a break at one point, became the head of the Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce. Do folks know that? He has spent a year in 1919. I'm not entirely sure why he did that, but I think he was trying to get his sense of duty and things into the business side of the world. He went back to the Forest Service, he became an activist, on game issues. He formed game protection societies, was the first person to really raise alarms about deer populations crashing, things like that. He also was the first person to draw lines between the dots of overgrazing and soil erosion in the Southwest. He took a lot of these observations to his supervisors, who unfortunately ignored a lot of his advice. But he really was looking at hard use of these landscapes, overuse, why humans do these things on the land. And then, of course, he was also one of the founders of the modern wilderness movement. And he got the Gila Wilderness Area, which is the nation's first established back in the 20s. He moved to Wisconsin in 1924, where he worked for the Forest Service for a little while, then he quit and he became what today we would call a consultant. And he drove around looking at a lot of wildlife issues in Wisconsin, very concerned about game populations. I eventually wrote a seminal publication called Game Management, which is still in use today. And in the process of this, he became the first wildlife biologist in the entire country at the University of Wisconsin. He, of course, also opened up the shack. They bought it, an old chicken coop, and began to restore a very, very degraded land. Became a well-known elder of the tribe, so to speak, towards the end of his life. But for me, more importantly, he spent a lot of his career writing. And this is very important on a lot of levels. And I think principally why we remember him today was through his writing. He also was a pioneer in restoration, prairie restoration. He was the first person to really push for prairie restoration. Started it there at the Arboretum in the University of Madison, Wisconsin. I love this quote. I may have heard it before. Game can be restored by the creative use of the same tools that have heretofore destroyed it: axe, plow, fire, and gun. This is pretty prescient stuff for 1933, right? He lived through the Dust Bowl, of course. It made a big impression on him on a lot of levels. And I really like this quote. And I think about Paul Gauguin, think about our nature as we read this quote. We end at what I think might be the standard paradox of the 20th century. Our tools are better than we are and grow faster than we do. They suffice to crack the atom and to command the tides, but they do not suffice for the oldest task in human history: how to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And I think what he's asking here, he's asking some pretty fundamental questions about our nature. Why do we do these things on these landscapes that are not in our self-interest in the long run? In 1944, he wrote a series of essays that are not widely read. I found them absolutely astonishing. He looked into the future. This is right near the end of World War II. And these three quotes, I think, are extreme. He was trying to answer the question, where are we going as well? If we are unable to steer the juggernaut of our own prosperity, then surely there is an impotence in our vaunted Americanism that augurs ill for the future. 1944. The impending industrialization of the world, now foreseen by everyone, means that many conservation problems heretofore local will soon become global. And finally, the hope of the future lies not in curbing the influence of human occupancy, is already too late for that, 1944, but in creating a better understanding of the extent and influence and a new ethic for government. So all Leopold is asking the same questions. Why do we do what we do, and where are we going? His answer, of course, was the land ethic. The last essay in his book, and these are some quotes from it. Many of you are familiar with it. I'm not going to kind of go into it right here. Basically enlarge that ethical boundary from just us, the focusing on us, to include the larger world, animals, plants, soils. He'd include nematodes. I'm sure if you had known about nematodes. And what he was trying to do here was trying to not just explain our contradictory behavior, but our self-destructive behavior. And I like to think of what he was trying to do is work on that right-hand side there. By enlarging our ethical sphere, by working on altruism and our imaginations and our analysis, trying to sort of tilt our behavior away from the primate side. And this is what the land ethic really is all about. We can say that maybe it wasn't quite as effective as Aldo hoped it would be, but it's certainly a way of looking at that question of our human nature and land management and our future by working on our behavior, our ethics, the way we write. He was a writer, how he communicated things, very imaginative, and also looking at the science and the analytical side of things. So I found this slide, and this kind of really sort of kicked me down the road here a little bit. This is from a class that was offered a summer ago by Arizona State University, which has a sustainability program. And I thought this was really an interesting advertisement. This shows you what the land ethic, which was published in 1949, has expanded to include today. And it includes a lot of the things that we've talked the last 2 days. But I like especially what's at the bottom there. Sustainability and humanities. This is an attempt by the professor, I assume, to try to bridge these larger disciplines, trying to understand how we can take a land ethic. Of course, Leopold never used the word sustainability, and try to get at larger truths here, try to get larger changes in behavior. And this led me to a word that I knew about, and I didn't really think a lot about until I sort of dug into a little bit, but thinking about the joining of sustainability and humanities there at the bottom. It's an example of the word consilience. And you probably had the same reaction I did when I first heard this, which is on that poster. What? What are you talking about? In fact, if you spend a little bit of time on the internet looking at this word, what you find pretty quick is a wine company in Santa Barbara County, Dave probably knows it, called Conciliums. But look at that symbol. I think it's interesting. It's 3 circles interlinked, and that's what it means. It means consilience. It's a concordance or an agreement of evidence. And this is a word that was invented by a scientist named William Whewell, who lived in England in the 1820s. He wrote a book, and in the book he defined this consilience. It happens when evidence from independent, unrelated sources converge into strong conclusions. That is, when multiple sources of evidence are in agreement, the conclusions can be very strong. And this, I think, is really important for trying to look into the future, and here's why. So here's an example of consilience. If you're going to measure the distance between the temples, pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx, you can use different methods, right? You can measure it by satellite imaging, by laser range finding, by meter stick. In all the cases, the answer should be approximately the same. So you begin to have consilience of different measuring techniques, and they also turn back and say that those measuring techniques are probably accurate in and of themselves if they have consilience on the distance between these objects. Another example, good example of a consilience is evolution. The theory of evolution is supported by a convergence of evidence. Genetics, molecular biology, paleontology, geology, biogeography, comparative anatomy, comparative physiology, many, many others. The strength of the evidence considered as a whole results in strong scientific consensus that the theory is correct. Conversely, to disprove evolution, these independent lines of evidence would have to be found in error, each one of them. In a similar way, evidence about the universe, this is another example of consilience, how they kind of arrived at the idea of the Big Bang, was to look at multiple lines of evidence drawn from astronomy, astrophysics, planetary geology, and so on. What I talked to you about earlier about the genetic understanding of our behavior and our migration patterns is another example of consilience. This is convergence of genetic biology, archaeology, paleontology, linguistics, all creating this portrait of human behavior and dispersal and movement many, many years ago. And this is a very good example of consilience in action. It also works in other levels. You start thinking about converging lines of evidence, concordance on, say, how we behave, how we treat each other. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, what is kind of a truth in behavior, and truth in beauty. These are examples, I think, of kind of consilience in the way we look at the world. We know, why do we know that something is beautiful? Well, it resonates in us at some level, some deep level that makes sense, that it feels like a convergence of form and function and beauty, all into kind of one place. When I started thinking about this, I thought, well, this is what we're doing and have been doing here for actually quite a long time. So when you have a rancher on the land who feels like he knows what's happening under the soil, and that resonates or converges with what the scientists are telling you is happening out there on the land, you have an example of consilience here. And this makes both arguments really powerful because they converge onto one place, right? And so this is an example of how consilience can lead to, I think, action. We talked about policy, things like that. And you start looking at other kinds of examples. These are some slides from early in the Quiviras. You have a consilience of of goals. We know how to manage these landscapes, how to change riparian areas, get them healthy. There's a consilience of goals here for federal land managers, as well as landowners, as well as environmentalists, kind of looking in on these landscapes. Begin to have kind of convergence, a concordance of evidence. And when these things converge together, powerful conclusions, powerful actions begin to happen. When we look at landscapes like this, we can ask ourselves what's healthy, which side is healthy, which side is maybe not so healthy. And then we can begin to ask ourselves, where are the consilience common ground here? Where can you get ranchers and conservationists to work together, agree on what a landscape should look like? It's also good for wildlife, including predators. It's also good for other kinds of herbivores as well. And begin to have kind of a broader consensus, a convergence of not just scientific theories, but looking at social and human, kind of even gut reactions to how these landscapes ought to be working. And then you throw in some economics on top of that. We've talked a lot about that in the last couple of days. I think this conference has been largely about consilience. We're talking about things that make sense, a lot of levels to us. They converge together in a way that can push us forward in positive ways. And it also extends to things kind of beyond the merely agricultural. We're looking at we know how to fix creeks, and so Bill's work, for example, is an example of hydrology and geomorphology and riparian biology working together with landowners to understand how to keep their farm in business, how to get riparian areas back for wildlife habitat, for all those kind of conciliant activities that separately we want to do it for that reason possibly, but together, when they converge together, when they have a concordance, it's extremely powerful, and it's also fun. And there's another kind of consilience here too, when folks understand. Remember the speaker last year at a conference that said it's not sustainable if it isn't fun, all right? So these are kind of concordance as well. This explains a little bit to me kind of an intuitive idea I had back in the early days at Quivira. I made this graph with Tamara's help. Consilience is another kind of a 64-cent word for the radical center. When you have a conservation collaborative working with land health goals in mind, the models of sustainable use, we enlarged that triangle and you had the radical center operating and things worked well. And that's what consilience is. Each one of those points of the triangle need to pull evenly and are in concordance and agreement on, say, producing grass-fed beef from landscapes for local communities, that kind of thing. It's also, I think, a different way of looking at what we did 2 years ago here at the conference, looking at larger landscapes. To me, this is a consilient landscape. This is what we produced for the Carbon Ranch conference, where you begin to look at harmonization of all these different things across the landscape. So not just food production, but conservation, wildlife, school kids, artists, fishermen, fish, all those kinds of things. When you begin to look at where those lines of consilience begin to kind of come together, land health being one, these are the kind of things that Leopold was talking about in the 30s and 40s. And then there's different kinds of convergences here. You look at these landscapes for multiple benefits, multiple uses. So the idea of mitigating climate change through food and land use. This is a consilience. This is looking at how to mitigate large climate concerns, the big problems through food and land use. And I'd never thought about this until a couple of years ago. This is an example of how consilience can work for larger programs. And of course, I think, as I said, this describes our conference this week. How are we going to feed 9 people from the ground up? We're only going to do it with those activities that merge together, that converge together, that make sense scientifically, economically, that beat deep in us as people, that make sense, that involve reciprocity and altruism. All those things that are that kind of offset the chimp side that wants to really to kind of rip these things apart. I also like this word because it's related to resilience, and resilience, of course, is in the mission statement for the Quivira Coalition. The Latin root is resalare, which means to leap or to jump, and resilience is, of course, to leap or jump back, to bounce back, to re-leap, so bounce back from a catastrophe, a crisis, a forest fire, excuse me. But what I like about consilience is that it takes the same root and said, let's jump forward together. And this then begins to get at that question of where are we going. So instead of being a little reactive, which is what kind of resilience is, let's think about how we jump forward together. What are those things that we are going to take with us into the Holocene, or into, the Anthropocene? As we leave the Holocene, how do we jump forward together? What is it that we want to be consilient about? And I think we know most of what we want to do. This book, this is not an original idea of mine. Edward O. Wilson wrote this book back in 1998 called Conciliums. It's kind of a grand unity of knowledge. He was trying to find common ground, a consilience, convergence between humanities, art, and science. And his argument in this book is that until we have that grand unity, until humanities and science and art all work together for a common purpose, we're not going to make real progress. It's kind of a big picture thing. It was written in '98. I'm not quite sure how much progress we've made towards the unity of knowledge. I like Aldo Leopold's approach. If you think about what he did, consilience, though he never used this word, was certainly what was on his mind. The multiple ways he lived his life. He was a scientist, he was a writer, he was an observer, he was a teacher, and he pulled all those different concerns and methods together into a whole that resonates very strongly with us to this day. I mean, there's a reason why we still read Aldo Leopold to this day. So I like to think of, instead of the grand unity of knowledge, I think we ought to focus on little consiliences, little things that make sense to us, things that are beautiful, things that are functional. This is an example of structure and function and beauty all at work here. That we know work on a scientific perspective. We know that they make sense to the landowner who wants something off the land, to the conservationist, everybody like that. And I think we have already thought out a lot of these things. Now is the time to kind of begin to try to converge them into something a little bit larger. I'm going to read something here at the end. So as I said at the beginning of this is sort of a personal journey for me. It started way back when I was 15 and kind of carried me through Quivira as we talk about these things. And I think consilience is something that I'm personally going to be working on myself. I'm interested in stories of consilience. Maybe we can find some unities we can talk about and write about them. But I want to end this way. So late one afternoon last September in the small but lovely Bayonne Valley in the heart of Cro-Magnon country in southwestern France, Jen and the kids and I climbed to the tippy top of a medieval castle on the southern side of a valley, which gave us a commanding view of a landscape that had been more or less continuously occupied by Homo sapiens for over 45,000 years. And by Neanderthals for about 300,000 years before that. The area had been a refuge for humans during the intense cold periods that gripped Europe off and on during the ice ages, and the numerous rock shelters in the region became desirable places to live, including one just a short distance across the valley from where we stood. By medieval times, 20,000 years later, the valley was still occupied by humans who were still earning a living from the land as they are today. After the departure of the Cro-Magnon, the valley became the site of scattered villages as the agricultural revolution took off. Next, marauding tribal bands occupied the area for centuries until the arrival of Caesar's legions brought some measure of stability and peace. With the fall of the Roman Empire, the area endured another round of political and economic disorder until the feudal system solidified, represented by the medieval tower that we had climbed. Much later, of course, came the tourists. So, Jen and I stood at the tippy top of the castle for a long time. We had come a long way to stand there at a considerable expense, and so we were determined to soak up every ounce of ambience as we could, at least until Sterling impatiently signaled that the castle was about to close and we would be locked inside. It was more than time and money, however, that made us linger. It wasn't even the view, it was the idea of the landscape that fascinated us. The humanness of this place was as old as the art we'd been seeing in the caves nearby. Somehow humans hadn't messed up this land, at least not in the way that we've messed up countless other landscapes over the centuries all over the world. It looked intact. It was inspiring to see a place that had no obvious signs of hard use despite its incomparable length of human occupation. There were lessons here about our behavior, both ancient and modern, I was certain. What were they? wasn't an idle question. It's looking likely that we're heading into another period of tumultuous times, if news headlines are any indication. How will we respond? When the Cro-Magnons walked out of the Bayonne Valley for the last time, the planet was in the process of trading the frigid stresses of the Ice Age for the stability and warm clemency of the Holocene. That stability is ending, many scientists say. We aren't returning to the Ice Ages, however. We're moving into something else altogether, something uncharted in human existence. Where are we going? What will happen? We don't know. But standing at the tippy top of the castle, surveying that lovely green valley, I thought, whatever happens, I bet we're going to need our inner Cro-Magnon. Fortunately for us, it's still there. Thank you.